his Lahore residence. And we'll be back with more news. And from ArabNews.com, Georgian Prime Minister tells Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky not to meddle in his country. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili accused Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of meddling in his country's political situation by commenting on protests there last week, prompting an angry response from Kiev. During the protests against a foreign agent law that critics have signaled is an authoritarian shift in Georgia, Zelensky thanked protesters for waving Ukrainian flags, saying it showed respect and he wished Georgians Democrats success. Last Friday, Georgia's parliament dropped the bill, which had threatened to harm Tbilisi's bid for closer ties with Europe. Critics has said it was inspired by a 2012 Russian law that's been used widely to crack down on dissent in Russia. When a person who is at war responds to the destructive action of several thousand people here in Georgia, this is direct evidence that this person's involved and motivated to make something happen here to change. Garibashvili said in an interview with the Georgian IMEDI television broadcast on Sunday, referring to Zelensky, "I want to wish everyone a timely end to this war and peace," Garibashvili added. However, Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesperson Ole Nikolenko accused Garibashvili of repeating Russian propaganda by suggesting that Kiev sought to draw Georgia into its conflict with Moscow. "We categorically reject such claims, which have nothing to do with reality. The Georgian authorities are looking for an enemy in the wrong place," Nikolenko said on Facebook on Monday. "Ukraine has been and will remain a friend of the Georgian people, whom we do not wish to stop in their task of building a European future." Despite Garibashvili's comments, Georgian public opinion is strongly pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian. Georgia fought its own brief war with Russia in 2008 over the status of two Moscow-backed breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia and Ukraine both aspire to join the European Union one day. And from TFI Global, NATO's pressing Georgia to follow the Ukraine model. The present ongoing protests in Georgia are reminiscent of 2014, the year when the fall of Ukraine started with the Euromaidan protests. Why do we say so? Here's why. 3 months into the year 2023, and it appears this is going to be crazier than 2022. Up till now, the Ukraine war was limited to the eastern part of Ukraine, but now spillover effects have started to erupt. While there are anti-NATO protests taking place in several European nations, a pro-NATO and pro-EU protest has taken the world by surprise. Last week, protests carrying Georgian, EU, and Ukrainian flags gathered outside the parliament building and shouted no to the Russian law. Georgia introduced 2 laws with the aim to block foreign interference in Georgian politics. The first bill on transparency of foreign influence aims to ensure transparency and envisages the registration of non-entrepreneurial, non-commercial legal entities and media outlets that receive more than 20% of their income from abroad as agents of foreign influence. The second bill on registration of foreign agents mandates any individual or legal entity receiving funds from abroad to register as a foreign agent. The author claims that the second draft is an exact copy of the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act against foreign agents, which was promulgated in 1938 as the U.S. responded to the threat of Nazism and other hostile ideologies. This has led to a widespread unrest in Georgia. Reportedly, demonstrators also blocked the city's central Rustaveli Avenue after calling for the main opposition party, the United National Movement, to gather there. However, Western leaders have expressed their full support for Georgia protests. The EU delegation in Georgia welcomed the announcement, saying it wanted to encourage all political leaders in Georgia to resume pro-EU reforms in an inclusive and constructive way. The EU is also considering Georgia's application for candidate status. Previously, the European Council President Charles Michel warned that the adoption of the so-called Foreign Agent Bill was not compatible with the EU path. EU's move in support of anarchy has left the Georgian government in doubt. They are now labeling the protesters as an attempt of interference. Protests. Georgia raises questions. Reportedly, the Georgia Prime Minister has accused the West and Ukraine of spreading the unrest deliberately. Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili has lashed out at Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky for rallying support for the mass protests in Tbilisi, Georgia. Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili has alleged that Kiev is to blame for the unrest caused by Georgia's contentious foreign agents law and has urged Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to take care of his own rather than inciting unrest in Tbilisi. Garibashvili vehemently denounced Zelensky's support, accusing him of attempting to establish a second front in Georgia against Russia earlier this week. Zelensky issued a video addressed to Georgians stating that every Ukrainian wishes a democratic and European success to the country. Garibashvili also charged Kiev with long-standing efforts to undermine Georgia, which he claimed predated the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. He claimed that the Kievs specifically sent former Georgian president and current Ukrainian official Mikhail Saakashvili home in October 2021 to stage a coup. Saakashvili was deliberately sent in. The main objective was to stage a coup here and prompt the nation to go to war. Today we have no doubts about it, said Garibashvili. The prime minister also claimed that a few dozen Georgian fighters returned from Ukraine, and the unrest over the foreign agents law urged them to have no illusions over the situation in the country. We know significantly more than they could imagine, he warned, adding that no second front will take place while the ruling Georgian Dream Party remains in power. Now here the question arises, and what exactly is the second front? Well, second front's an idea that's been long in the discussions by the NATO allies. If one remembers, last year in September, there's been reports that NATO are vying over the options of opening new fronts against Russia to slow Moscow's gains in Ukraine. So Georgia's proposed holding a referendum and asking if Georgians want war with Russia. Reportedly, the Georgian authorities were considering holding a national referendum on whether or not Georgians want to go to war with Russia. At a press conference held in the headquarters of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, Georgia Kobakhidze, the party's chairman, announcing the motion in a pretty heroic motion. Minister Kobakhidze had to emphasize, let the people decide if they want to open a second front in Georgia against Russia. He further added, we'll act as people say. However, Prime Minister Garibashvili later on derailed these plans, saying that Georgia could turn into a shooting range if opposition leaders had managed to take control of the country. He said that Kiev harassed Tbilisi to join the confrontation with Russia. It's worth noting, when Russia's again advancing into crucial Ukrainian cities, the accusations of Second Front have started emerging, but because the Prime Minister of the Georgian Dream Party is against the motion, protests have widened across to Georgia. This appears to be own Euromaidan protest of Georgia to ensure Georgia goes down the Ukraine way. Euromaidan reboot. It was only Euromaidan protest, also known as the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, that hastened Ukraine's shift to the West. The civil unrest that began in November 2013 started after then-President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to suspend negotiations with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. As the Georgia protests grew in size and intensity, the Ukrainian government responded with force, using riot police and special forces to disperse protests and impose a state of emergency. The conflict between the Ukrainian government and the Euromaidan protests quickly escalated, with clashes becoming increasingly violent. In February 2014, Yanukovych was ousted from power by a coalition of opposition leaders, and a new government was formed. After that, Ukraine followed every step and statement of Western leaders, and now, 7 years later, Ukraine is a battleground between Russia and the West. Georgia is now being pushed upon the same path now. Tbilisi didn't want a war against Moscow, as the reports start to emerge that final battle for Kiev is about to begin as Russia's forces are lining up at Ukraine's border. But now Georgia protests and unrest have now erupted, making it sure that Georgian Dream Party spirals out of Georgian politics and someone pro-West storms into power. The second front against Russia has started to emerge, and here on the escalation of war looks highly likely. And from Yeni Safak, Russian diplomat says West creates attention in Georgia, Moldova for confrontation with Moscow. Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko says West trying to dictate Georgia, Moldova what to do. The West creates hotbeds of tensions in Georgia and Moldova for confrontation with Russia, Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko said on Tuesday. Speaking to the state-run TASS news agency, Grushko said Russia is concerned over recent developments in these countries, as they have key significance for the country's security interests. Of course, we're concerned about the situation in Georgia and the situation in Moldova because these are our neighbors, and we see that the U.S. and its satellites are working to create more and more hotbeds of tensions along our borders and are trying to arrange some kind of geopolitical competitions in these zones, which are key even for geographical reasons for the security interests of the Russian Federation, Grushko stressed. The diplomat added that Western states demonstrate a neo-colonial approach, acting in a way that only they have the right to dictate what to do to Georgia and Moldova. While in Georgia there was mass protest against the foreign agency's law, which was later dropped, Moldova has had a new government following a prolonged economic crisis, and tensions have also risen in the breakaway regions of Transnistria. Turning to investigation of last year's Nord Stream pipeline blast, Grushko said Russia is going to seek absolute clarity of all the circumstances of the sabotage. We proceed from the fact that it's necessary to put an end to this story, to deal with those who are guilty, and they should be held accountable, he said. From Press TV, Georgian Premier warns Ukraine's Zelensky against meddling in country's domestic affairs. The Georgian Prime Minister has accused Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of meddling in his country's domestic affairs by commenting on ongoing protests against a controversial bill claimed to be inspired by Russia. Over the past days, thousands of people have taken to the streets of Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, to protest against a foreign agent's draft law, which targets the disclosure of money flows from abroad. The proposed legislation stipulates that organizations such as media outlets could be classified as foreign agents if they receive more than 20% of the funding from abroad. Critics claim the legislation is a way for the Georgian government to crack down on opposing voices. Detractors have also pointed to a similar law passed in Russia where all organizations or individuals receiving financial support from abroad or under some form of a foreign influence are declared foreign agents. Reacting to the protests in Georgia, Zelensky thanked the demonstrators for waving Ukrainian flags and said it showed respect for Kiev, wishing Georgian democratic success. According to reports, at least 66 people were arrested on Tuesday evening as the protests turned violent. When a person who's at war responds to the destructive action of several thousand people here in Georgia, this is direct evidence that this person is involved, motivated to make something happen here too, to change, Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili said in an interview with the state TV on Sunday. I want to wish everyone a timely end to this war and peace, Garibashvili said. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Saturday likened the protest to a coup attempt being orchestrated from abroad to create an irritant on Russia's borders. Stressing that the foreign agents legislation had been used as an excuse to start, generally speaking, an attempt to change the government by force, Lavrov equated the rallies with Kiev's Maidan uprising that toppled a Russian-friendly administration in Ukraine in 2014. Georgia fought its own brief war with Russia in 2008 over the status of the two Moscow-backed breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia applied for EU membership together with Ukraine and Moldova days after Russia launched a military campaign in Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Russia began its special military operation in Ukraine with a declared aim of demilitarizing Donbass, which is made up of the Donetsk and Luhansk self-proclaimed republics. Back in 2014, the two republics, which are predominantly Russian-speaking, broke away from Ukraine, prompting Kiev to launch a bloody war against both regions. The years-long conflict has killed more than 14,000 people, mostly in the Donbass. Since the onset of the conflict between the two countries, the United States and European allies have unleashed an array of unprecedented sanctions against Russia and poured numerous batches of advanced weapons into Ukraine to help its military fend off the Russian troops, despite repeated warnings by the Kremlin that such measures will only prolong the war. And watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, share, and subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction.
The whole notion of
Demonstrated our
logic.
superior weapons, they should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whipped them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable,
The whole notion
You'd
of
make
logic.
a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Yahoo!